I want people to understand this because there is some confusion. Um, the 28 manuscripts that you have found, and there are some people that have heard the story, but I want people to understand a little bit about what that process was, Nehemia, because it really is the reason that this really, when you went, yep, we should do it, it was because we were dealing with the manuscripts, not just Howard's manuscript, which was based on 9 manuscripts that he had. But can you give us just a little bit about what that process was?
So Howard had the 9 manuscripts that he lists in his book. And what I did is I went to the National Library of Israel, to the Institute of, at the time it wasn't the National Library, it was the Jewish National and University Library. And I looked through the catalog of the Institute of Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts, which has or attempts to have a catalog of, or actually photographs of every Hebrew manuscript in the world. And I say attempts to have because over the last year I've learned that that's not entirely true. They have a large percentage of the Hebrew manuscripts in the world photographed. And once they had the photographs, then they would catalog them and say, okay, we have microfilm number 51023. What's in there? Mm-hmm. And they would write down what was in there. And sometimes they're cataloged in detail because one of the things that would happen in Hebrew manuscripts is you would have somebody who would order a manuscript from a scribe, and he'd say, you know, I'm a doctor, and so I want something in this manuscript about medicine, but I also, in my spare time, I want to study Maimonides, but I'm also interested in astronomy. So you'd have a manuscript that was a collection of like 5 different things, copied from 5 different sources. And what they did in the Institute of Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts is they went through every one of the manuscripts they had photographs for, even some they didn't have photographs for, where they actually went to the library and cataloged it by hand without even bringing photographs back. And they made this database. And so I opened up the database and asked the simple question, first, what are the 9 manuscripts that Howard had? I want to see them with my own 2 eyes, at least the photographs with my own 2 eyes.
That's important.
Then I said, what other manuscripts are there? Right? Howard mentions in the introduction to his book from 1987, The Gospel of Matthew According to a Primitive Hebrew Text, he says, this is just the foundation. You know, he explained something that was really important, which is that, why did Howard do this in the first place? He kind of stumbled upon Hebrew Matthew. Up until Howard, everybody who had discussed Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew had understood it to be the same version that was published in the 1500s by these 2 priests. One was a Protestant priest named Munster, and the other was a Catholic priest named du Tillet. And each one of them found, or said they found, a Hebrew manuscript among the writings of the Jews with Matthew in it, and then they published it. And everyone assumed that Munster and du Tillet's Matthew was the same as Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. And Howard, out of curiosity, ordered a copy from the British Library, and he immediately saw this is completely different. Not completely 100% different, but it's from the time of Shem Tov through du Tillet, it's gone through this incredible revision where it looks much more like the Greek text in du Tillet and Munster, but in the Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, which is what we'll be discussing primarily, it preserves things that you don't find in the Greek sometimes. It'll have, like verse 17, the whole verse is omitted.
Right. So, I read something that he said, just one little thing he said in there. This isn't related to what you're about to talk about. He says, when I examined Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew more carefully, I was astounded to discover that its core was an original Hebrew composition, not a translation. Moreover, the kind of Hebrew in which it was written is just what one would expect of a document composed in the 1st century AD and preserved by Jews during the Middle Ages. That's a pretty big statement.
It's an extremely bold statement.
Yes.
And he's been heavily criticized for it. But it's very important what he says. If you read his article, and we called upon the people to read the article in preparation for this. He wrote an article in 1986. I want to read some excerpts. He says, it is now possible to recover much of the original Hebrew composition from an extant manuscript. That's profoundly different from saying, I have the original written by Matthew in the 1st century. And he gives the analogy. He talks about Ben Sira, or the wisdom of Sirach, which is part of the Apocrypha. So we have the full Greek text that was preserved by the Christian church as part of the Septuagint. We have manuscripts from the 3rd century, or around the year 300. And in the wisdom of Sirach, or Ben Sira, it says in the introduction it was translated from Hebrew by the grandson of the author, and he's writing that around 175 BC. meaning the book itself was written around 200 BC. But we don't have the Hebrew original, or we didn't have the Hebrew original until, and it was debated for centuries. Is it true that it was written in Hebrew, or is this just kind of something to give it more credibility? The author claims it was written in Hebrew in order to, give it more spice. People will look at that and say, "Oh, this is a legitimate document," because it wasn't just written in Greek; it was written in Hebrew and translated into Greek. Or was it really written in Hebrew? This was a debate in scholarship for hundreds of years. And then in 1896, these two Scottish sisters, Lewis and Gibson, were traveling through Cairo, and they came upon the Ben Ezra synagogue. And in the Ben Ezra synagogue, they found these documents in a closet. And they asked the people there, "Can we have these?" And they bought the documents from the Jews there and brought them back to Cambridge University to a professor there named Solomon Schechter. And Solomon Schechter immediately recognized one of the documents as the Hebrew text of Ben Sira. Now, you'd think it would end here. We have the Hebrew text of Ben Sira. However, it was from the Cairo Geniza and dated to around the year 1000. And people said, wait a minute, we have Ben Sira from 300 AD in the Greek. What do we, that Hebrew text from the year 1000 is 700 years later. It's probably a translation from Greek. In other words, they're saying even if it was written in Hebrew, it was translated into Greek and then translated back into Hebrew. And this was hotly debated about whether it was even originally written in Hebrew, even after Solomon Schechter published the Hebrew text. And he had multiple manuscripts as well. And it wasn't until Yigal Yadin, the Israeli archaeologist from Hebrew University, went to excavate at Masada. And at Masada, they uncovered fragments of the original Hebrew of Ben Sira. And this finally definitively proved that that Ben Sira, the Wisdom of Sirach, was originally written in Hebrew and from there translated into Greek. Now, what Howard points out, and is a very important point, is if you compare the fragments found by Yigal Yadin on Masada from around the year 0, right? There's no year 0, right? But from, let's say, 100 BC or 50 BC. So if you compare those to the one from the year 1000, it's gone through a major change, meaning as scribes copied the text, they would maybe put things into their own language, they would change the wording. Often it might not be on purpose, it would just be out of habit. There'd be a certain term there and they would replace it with a different term they're more familiar with. And so what happened is we have the full Greek text of Ben Sira, which we know was translated from Hebrew around 175 BC. We have fragments, a verse here and a verse there in Hebrew, from the Second Temple period found at Masada. And then we have a much fuller text, not the entire text, but most of the text and a number of manuscripts from the Cairo Geniza. Now, that doesn't mean that the Hebrew from the Cairo Geniza is exactly what Ben Sira wrote in 200 BC, because the text went through changes over time. And the point is that Howard compared this to Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. He said, look, these rabbis preserved it. And as they preserved it, they would do things that rabbis would do. For example, if they saw God's name, Yud-He Vav-He, there's no way they would leave that in the Gospel of Matthew. They would replace that with Hashem. We know that's what the Jewish scribes would do. And so just as Ben Sira was written in Hebrew, translated into Greek, and we have a Hebrew descendant of that text from the Cairo Geniza, he argued that this Hebrew Matthew text was analogous, that it wasn't word for word what Matthew wrote in the first century, but within it you could recover some of the original text.